also really excited that our next panel, which is right now, is into the equity and procurement. And as you've heard, this was a top priority. This whole issue and matter was a top priority for the Chamber, as well as the California African American Chamber and the California Hispanic Chamber this last year, with Assembly Bill 915, which would have codified the state's 25% small business procurement goal. When we were planning this summit, we really were hopeful that by the time October 13th came around, we would be talking about the legislative victory and what this rollout of this bill would be. We're not there yet, but we still learned so much this last year in the advocacy process, and so honored of the panelists that have joined us, especially for Senator Mann. He came on as a Senate co-author of our bill, and that significantly helped move the needle and move it through the committees that Member Chu referenced. We're also joined by Angela Schell. She's the Deputy Director of the California Department of General Services. She is the Chief Procurement Officer. She's very, very sharp at what she does, and I'm looking forward to her insight into the matter. And then we have Rick Fultz, who is the Executive Director of Biocom California. With that, Senator Mann, I give the floor to you for a couple minutes just to share your perspective on this issue, and then we'll transition along and then go into questions.
Thank you, and I'll try to actually do a couple minutes and not do the politician thing of turning 2 minutes into 15 minutes. But my name is Dave Mann, and I represent the 37th State Senate District in Orange County. And I just want to first thank you, David, and everyone for allowing me to join this incredibly important discussion on how we can build out support for minority-owned small businesses in procurement, and more generally, how we can do better to advocate for small businesses and particularly minority-owned small businesses. And this is an important issue for me, but then also for my district. For me, as one of only 2 Asian Americans in the state Senate, and then when Richard Pan terms out next year, possibly being the only one, I have to advocate for minorities. I have to advocate for Asian Americans. And my district, which encompasses my home city of Irvine, Costa Mesa, Tustin, Newport Beach, Laguna Beach, Huntington Beach, Orange, Villa Park, Anaheim Hills, and others, is incredibly diverse. It's about 45% non-white, and it is small businesses are a clear economic driver. So this is clearly important for the district. By way of my background, I'm a failed entrepreneur. I was an undergrad in business at the Wharton School, got convinced to try to do a startup after that. And we hit the 2001 downturn, which some of you may remember, and they pulled the plug on our financing, and saw firsthand how difficult it is to put your blood, sweat, tears, and capital into something that you're building. And so I'm grateful to all the small business owners that are on this call for what you do for our communities and for our economy, for our employees. Without you, I think our economy here in California would be in dire shape. After that business failed, I went to law school, and I ended up doing a lot of economic policy, whether at the Securities and Exchange Commission, where I started my career, whether as a banking counsel for Senator Chuck Schumer, or at the Center for American Progress, a leading think tank. And in my time in the Senate, I've only been here, I guess, about 9.5 months, or 10.5 months. I've tried to be an advocate for small business. I was a principal author of SB 87, which created or added $2.1 billion to the COVID-19 Small Business Relief Grant Program. I supported Andreas Borges, a Republican, in his efforts to try to reduce or waive civil penalties for minor infractions that were unintentional for small businesses. SB 430 was the bill, and it failed, but I promised him that I would spearhead that bill next year, because I think it is very difficult to be a small business in the state, and I think we can try to make it easier. I also did talk, as some of you probably know, my district has been the epicenter of this oil spill. And I did talk with Governor Newsom about trying to find some bridge financing for small businesses out here in the district that have been negatively impacted by this oil spill. Our beaches were shut down for almost 2 weeks, and obviously the local businesses depend a lot on tourism for all of that. So I understand that CalAsian Chamber represents over 600,000 API-owned businesses, which collectively generate more than $181 billion in annual revenue here in California. And minority owned small businesses in my district and across California obviously have played a critical role in the Golden State's economy, and many of them have been the hardest hit during this pandemic for a lot of different reasons, including the unfortunate rise of anti-Asian hate and bias. I think the data we have shows that these entities not only have had a harder time with the pandemic, but they've also had a harder time accessing support from the government, trying to get those funds. And when they have applied, they're less likely to receive the funds that they requested. Some of this is language access. Some of it may be due to other causes. So we've got a lot of work to do here. And I just want to give one anecdote. Some of you may recall earlier this year when the DMV came out with a proposal to eliminate something like 25 languages from its written driver's test. Most of those were languages that were Asian languages, including Korean, and I'm a Korean American, but I think Hindi, there are a number of Asian languages that would have been impacted, and that would have been very, very negatively impacting huge swaths of immigrant communities, of new American communities. And we've got to do better. So I immediately called the governor and asked him if he could get this changed. We issued a press release. We did a press conference. And that next day, Governor Newsom announced that the DMV was overturning that proposal. So language access is important, but so is representation. And I'm here to try to advocate for you. And I'm eager to learn more about what we can do aside from taking on AB 915 next year, which I will do. And you have my commitment for that. So thank you again for having me today.
Thank you, Senator Mann. I really appreciate that. And we have it on tape, so that's great. Thank you for the support. Angela Schell, I give you a couple of minutes to kind of set the table for your role with DGS, and for those that maybe are unfamiliar of how important your agency is for small business interaction and procurement with the state of California.
Thank you. And thank you for having us here today. I want to thank the CalAsian Chamber for inviting us. So yes, I'm Angela Schell, and I'm first and foremost the state's Chief Procurement Officer. So my role is to represent the entire state of California for our state departments who are doing purchasing across the state. DGS is where our office resides. So we're a centralized procurement office, and we delegate purchasing authority to all of the state departments that are under the administrative branch. So, we also have huge importance is the Office of Small and Disabled Veteran Business Enterprises. And so that office has been around for a very long time within DGS. And over the years, there, has been legislation and regulations that have, shifted a little bit of our duties, but excuse me, ultimately our role and responsibility is really to assist small businesses in the state of California with state contracting. So we do certification for both of the small businesses and the disabled veteran business enterprises. We do that solely within the state. We do have local entities that partner with us. We recently entered into an agreement with the university system that now accepts the DGS state certification, which means it just made it a little bit easier for our small businesses in the state when they're contracting with the UC system. So we have responsibility for setting policy and procedure as well for use of state small businesses and DVBEs throughout the state departments. Again, our locals also, local government entities also look to DGS for our policies and procedures. So, we have a big job here at DGS, and we've been doing this for quite some time, as I said. Just a little bit of history on me. This is my 27th year working for the state of California as a civil servant. I truly believe that, it is my job to serve the state of California. And I have spent most of my career in the state of California helping small businesses and DVBEs. I previously worked for the Department of Transportation. I was in what is now known as their Civil Rights Office, but formerly was the Office of Business and Economic Opportunity, as well as their Construction Division in enforcement and compliance of contract requirements for SBs and DVBEs, as well as prevailing wage requirements, state and federal labor laws on public works projects. So I've spent, again, the greater amount of my career, looking in these areas and where we can assist our small businesses and our DVBEs with getting their foot in the door and, getting the opportunity to perform a state contract, but also to be successful at performing that state contract. Because what we often hear from our small businesses is it's great to get your foot in the door, but if you can't be successful in, completing that contract on behalf of the state, it's damaging. It's damaging to your reputation. It's damaging to your ability. And it may be that it was a small thing that caused you to, not be able to perform in the way that you can. And so, a lot of our goals with the small business and the DVBE program, again, looking at Prop 209 and, those restrictions that as Assemblymember Chu talked about, with going from being able to set specific contract goals, which we can no longer do, we can still do that for small businesses. So how can we work within the requirements of Prop 209 to identify more opportunities to spread the wealth for our small businesses that are also women and minority owned? And so those are a lot of the areas that we are looking to, that we continue to look to, but our outreach is one of our biggest assets in our program. And I'll talk more about that as we go through some of the questions that are there, but that's really a big focus for DGS, is looking at outreach and, working and having partnerships with the CalAsian Chamber, the Hispanic Chamber, all of the chambers that are out there, the small business development centers. Those are all of the areas in which we are focusing to increase our outreach and our education.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Angela. Some great things. I took some notes on. I'll circle back with you on that. Rick Fultz is the Executive Director of Biocom California. And Rick, why don't you give us the same, table set of what you do and what Biocom does and their perspective on this issue.
Yeah, I'm not going to be able to give the same amount of support that Angela and Senator Mann do for our folks here, but I'll sure try. Biocom California, I'm sorry, my name is Rick. I'm the Chief Business Officer at Biocom California. We are the Life Science Association for California. We have 1,500 member companies that we represent, everything from two-person R&D shops to big pharma, med device, digital diagnostics, some really innovative companies up and down the state. We do kind of an A to Z for these companies, so local, state, and federal lobbying, legislative and regulatory support, workforce development, capital development, networking, facility support, you name it. And we have a group purchasing organization that does try to set industry standards for best practices for supply chain and purchasing, which is what obviously we'll get into a little bit here today. From our perspective, not only our purchasing group, but Biocom California has obviously tried to tackle diversity in the workforce. People of color and women and minorities on boards in leadership roles. There's a dearth of that in our industry. For us, we tackle a couple different areas. It's a lot about access, K through 12, STEM education. There's huge disparate numbers in just access to that kind of programming. So we look at it all the way from K to 12, but the companies themselves, making sure they're supported, that they can flourish. We also tackle purchasing and supply chain professionals, right? There's a lack of diversity within the workforce in the areas that are making these supply chain decisions. And then finally, the tougher one, quite frankly, for us to tackle is actual supplier diversity. So in the life science industry, there's a lot of big players, multinational organizations and suppliers. So getting smaller companies, oftentimes these are smaller organizations, but getting diverse suppliers into the fold is challenging. I think for the life science industry, it's very well proven that diversity of thought is positive for outcomes for business, right? It's very clear that inclusion and diversity helps drive better outcomes for the businesses. It's harder to prove that for supply chain, that using a diverse supplier base is financially beneficial to an organization. So we work towards that. It is a struggle. It's something, we do quite a few things towards, but it's just harder to prove than what's already known about diversity of thought. So it's something we're very keen on improving, and excited to be in this conversation to talk about it. So really, really thankful for being here.
And thank you for that, Rick. And you may not have been logged on during the earlier in the program when we did a poll, but the last question of the poll, it was, do you know what your place of work organization is doing to prioritize building an equitable economic recovery? And so, surprising to me, the top response by, I want to say, close to 90%, if not 90%, was we're ready and constantly moving the needle. So to kind of dovetail off of what you just shared, how it sounds like Biocom is a part of that forward-thinking, solution-oriented process. And I know that all of us, just because we're in the largest ethnic minority chamber in the state doesn't mean we have all the answers by any stretch of the imagination. We're searching, which is partly why we're having this summit here today. But what is Biocom doing to address equitable recovery, and in this case also addressing equity in the procurement pipeline, or in the procurement pipeline? Anything you'd like to share with that would be beneficial.
Yeah. Again, and like I said, we're trying to address it earlier on too, right? The actual workforce themselves, the access, so that you have a diverse and representative workforce, I think will help in decision making that happens. But again, so there's incentives we put in place. Our members spend, just in our contract alone, almost $500 million a year with Thermo Fisher, for example. We have prioritized and negotiated a cash back on diverse spend. So they track every dollar that comes through their distribution channel. And, in the life sciences, Thermo Fisher is the big spend. There's just no way around it. So they track every dollar that goes in. Your dollar could go to Corning for a beaker, or it could go to a diverse supplier for a beaker. There's now incentives for that to be diverse spend. That's a great first step, right? It's real dollars. It does move the needle and does change behavior. What we're lacking, I guess, again, that ROI, what can we tell besides the obvious incentive itself? We're still struggling to prove to them why that is beneficial for their business. You always want second sources. That's supply chain 101. You don't want to put all your eggs in one basket, but if you are going to put eggs in different baskets, why would diverse suppliers? We are struggling for the why from a kind of financial return perspective, and I'd love to hear Angela and others' thoughts on it. But again, setting up incentives, we know it's the right thing to do, so that's good enough for doing it. It would be great to have more to back it up so we can do more things. But we set up there are little incentives like that with other suppliers we have, education events and things like that to try to just again create access. That's really in my naive viewpoint here. That's a really important thing we can do. But we're always looking to improve that model.
Right. Thank you, Angela. I want to talk, and you touched on outreach. I do want to talk about that, but you had mentioned something in the beginning of your remarks that seemed to reference an agreement with the CSU, and I know I missed a couple of things in those comments. Could you elaborate a little more about what that was you were referring to with the I believe the CSU system and procurement?
Sure. It's actually the UC system.
Okay,
CSU kind of falls under the administrative branch in terms of using the same procurement processes, whereas the UC can be a little bit different in their procurement processes, and they may not follow everything that's in my contracting policies and procedures. But what we did is we sit on a panel that they have, or a committee that they have, that just talks about small business participation. And one of my team members has been participating in that for probably over a year. And the suggestion came up about, how do we get small businesses, more small businesses to participate in the UC system procurement offerings? And, how can we make it easier? And one of the recommendations was, well, let's enter into a reciprocity agreement with DGS, which means that the UC simply sends their buyers to the DGS website that has all of the certified small businesses in the state of California. And they look for that certification that's in the specific area that they're looking for procurement, and they go ahead and they accept that certification. So instead of a small business in the state going to UC and having to follow a separate process, at least for certification, they're now able to use the existing process that's already in place. If you're certified under DGS's requirements, your certification is now accepted by UC. And there's approximately $5 billion in spend that the UC is expecting to be available over the course of the next fiscal year for opportunities for small businesses. And so I think that's a huge win for small businesses in the state, in that it's an efficiency for them. It's one less certification. We've all talked about it. The state does have a lot of requirements, and to the extent that we can continue to reduce those requirements, we're reducing those access barriers for our small businesses to get in and start to get state contracts.
That is great news. When was that reciprocity agreement finalized?
I believe it was late last month.
Okay, great. That certainly is great news, and I probably will be following up with you or your office just to gather more details and see how we can be a resource there. And so to the second part with outreach, you might be familiar that in our bill, AB 915, which was also co-authored by Senator Mann, outreach was an important part, because we understand that we could have all the greatest policies in the world, but if the business owner doesn't know about it, then it just kind of sits there. So, one thing that we saw as a small success in that some agencies developed an internal policy around proactive outreach to business owners, whether they be minority or not. Can you tell us what your agency's ambitions are around outreach, what that looks like, where you see there could be opportunities, and how best to get in front of the business owners, especially the minority business owners?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we do a lot of outreach with our OSDS office here in DGS, and we do touch on, we have over 30 partnerships, excuse me, throughout the state with the ethnic chambers and others, minority and women represented entities. And we let our state departments know that we have these outreach events. In fact, many of them participate in those outreach events with us. So when we get an invite, we're talking to our state departments to also have them participate in that outreach. We continue to communicate to our state departments about the fact that they can use state dollars to conduct outreach specifically to minority organizations. There has been legislation that's been on the books for quite some time that outreach is in fact allowed directly to minority organizations, and it doesn't violate the requirements set forth in Prop 209. And so we continue to outreach to our departments on, look, we have these outreach events. We want you to continue to outreach to these organizations. It's okay to outreach to these organizations. And I think that's one of the areas where DGS plans to really step up its education as well to state departments. There's a lot of turnover in the state. That's the beauty of having a state workforce. There's a lot of opportunity for people to move around in state service. And so what that does is it brings in new employees. And so I think we need to continue to educate our state departments on the opportunities that are there for outreach, have them partner with us. One of the things that we were able to implement over the course of the last year or so is getting those larger departments. And it was through I'm going to give the credit to our DGS Small Business Advisory Council. We were able to get some of these, especially these larger departments, to post their upcoming procurements as upcoming on their websites. So it's not just going to the state's Cali Procure system where solicitations are required to be advertised. It's state departments also having a link on their website to say, hey, here's what's coming up. Small businesses, if you're interested in working with DGS specific contracts, so, my department issuing a contract for whatever good or service it is, here's a list that's going to be coming up. And we're just letting you know that it's coming up. So if you want to think about, how you might participate, if you're certified or not, we do a lot of flyers that we send out on upcoming procurements that are leveraged procurement agreements with DGS, which means they're large scale procurements that are put in place for state departments to actually buy from. So we do outreach in that way as well. And again, we focus at DGS especially on these partnerships and sponsorships. And so we actually provide, sponsorship dollars to entities that have upcoming events, that have multiple state departments there, so that we can help them get that outreach on, what the state has coming up and what our processes are. We also have some strategic partnerships where we are looking at translating our documents into alternate languages. If you were to go to the DGS website, you would see a couple of our videos that are out there on, how to get into the state's CalAProcure system, are translated currently into Spanish. We are working on other languages. It just so happens that we have some bilingual staff for the Spanish language, so we're able to do that. But we are continuing to work on other ways in which we can, reach diverse businesses where English may not be their first language. We want them to be able to know what the opportunities are, first and foremost, in the way that they're familiar with hearing it.
Great, thank you for that. Senator Mann, you are relatively newly elected, and you couldn't have been thrown in at a more difficult time as an elected public servant. But I've always appreciated, of course, your support of the chamber. Appreciate your co-authorship of our bill, but I've really admired how intentional you are about really having an ear to the needs of your constituents. And so what have you gleaned from what you see in your district, from a business owner's perspective, on where things need to change from a state bureaucracy perspective, so that a business can be successful in general, as well as in the procurement pipeline? I'm sure you've received a lot of feedback this last year from business owners, so I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, thank you for the question, David. And, I appreciate hearing the discussion earlier from Angela and Rick, just because I have to be honest, procurement's not something I know a lot about. I know the state has a lot of control over the process, but, the state bureaucracy is sprawling, right? And one of the things, I thought I knew how big state government was before I became an elected, and then you get a sense of like every agency has sub-agencies and commissions, and it is really a difficult agency structure to navigate, and that means that the regulatory structure is also very challenging. And I think GoBiz does a really good job of trying to help small business owners or those considering opening a small business. But I know it can be really daunting. Like if you're like, I think David, Assemblymember Chu, soon to be City Attorney Chu, was just on, and I overheard him talking about how difficult it is to open an ice cream shop. And I hear that all the time here. And some of those are city regulations, but a lot of them are state. And, the story I always tell is, I had a very broad and diverse set of support during my campaign for this seat. One of my close supporters was a Bernie Sanders supporter, but he was also a small business owner. And he would mention how difficult it was to run and operate a small business in this state. And to me, that's the canary in the coal mine. If a Bernie Sanders supporter is saying, hey, there's too much regulation, that's something we ought to be really paying attention to. So I think there's like a lot of different directional things we could be doing. Unfortunately, there's not a way to just wave a magic wand and say, make it easier for small businesses, because each type of small business answers to different types of regulation. Obviously, there's workplace regulation. There's certain types of things that are universal. But if you're a restaurant or you have a liquor license, you're going to be treated very differently than, say, if you're a racetrack or a hair salon or anything else. So, what we've tried to do is encourage people both in terms of the lobbyists in Sacramento, but also individuals who own small businesses to reach out to us proactively, because you're going to know your business and your regulatory environment much better than I or my staff will, and just try to come to us with ideas. And my approach is we got to start with the low-hanging fruit. We're not going to get to where a lot of people on this call probably want to get to as far as the regulatory environment in the state, but we can start chipping away in that direction, and hopefully make some progress. Now, obviously, this year is unique in that we had a pandemic and the challenges of that, and that obviously impacted Asian businesses, as I mentioned earlier, much more so than other types of businesses, particularly the sort of forward-facing Asian businesses, like Asian restaurants, hair salons, nail salons, and businesses that sort of had an Asian face attached to it. And those businesses really did struggle. And we saw that, for a lot of reasons again. So trying to make sure that we were providing enough bridge funding for these businesses to survive this climate, but also that minority businesses and Asian American owned businesses were able to access that, I think is important. And I think it also illustrated a longer lasting problem, which is that for a lot of reasons, I think familiarity with the language, maybe language access, comfort level with accessing government support, Asian and new American businesses really do have a problem getting any kind of state funding. And I don't think it's confined to COVID. So we've got to go further in trying to figure out what the problem is here and how we can address that, whether it's, COVID funding or any other type of small business programming, funding, resources that we're providing as a state.
Thank you. There's a website that I used to use a lot when I did outreach for the state. Back in the day, I did small business outreach with the Board of Equalization and Department of Tax and Fee Administration. And there's a website that's operated by GoBiz. It's called calgold.ca.gov. And while you were talking, Senator, it's like an aggregate site that you can put the type of business and where it's located, and then it will show you all the levels of government that you're going to have to go through. And so while you were talking, I typed in restaurant, Irvine, and I counted 24 layers of government from the city all the way up to the federal. 12 of those layers are state. And frankly, it doesn't even include DGS. It doesn't, if they want to get in the procurement pipeline, then there's another set. So, I think there's certainly a lot to be done when it comes to those regulatory, I wouldn't say they're barriers, but they certainly can disincentivize an entrepreneur to continue to make those steps.
What was the website again?
So CalGold, so CAL gold.ca.gov. Yeah. It's a very informative website, and it's almost shockingly simple in what it shows. Rick, I wanted to speaking of potential barriers, from the perspective of Biocom and the life sciences industry, where are there I guess you could say systemic barriers to entry from a state perspective? Where do your members run into challenges to either get in procurement pipelines or to grow their business from a life science perspective? Because I like that you're here, because it's an industry we don't often hear from in forums like this. So I'd like to hear a little bit more where those challenges might lie for your industry.
Yeah, I think for industry companies, so for biotechnology companies, there's a whole host of support for them. So getting FDA connections, state, local facilities, operations, fire marshals, all that kind of stuff. They actually have a lot of resources to help them. I think it's on the service provider side, people supporting the life science industry, that huge kind of lesser known industry. That's where there's challenges. I think small minority owned businesses have a tough time understanding, just like you said, the 24 layers for a restaurant in Irvine. If you add in the complexity of becoming a contract research organization in the state of California, there's a lot more regulation involved in that. So GoBiz has been helpful over the years, but I do think there's a lot. We helped our members get DPAS certifications, right? When the Defense Production when they were, triaging supplies, right? Plastics and PPE and things like that. At a federal level, we were able to connect our members, including those service providers, distributors of PPE, and all those companies that popped up. But honestly, the smaller minority-owned organizations, they got squeezed because they didn't have the resources to get the certifications necessary to meet that demand quickly, right? So on the state level, it's the same thing. I think there's ongoing certifications around hazardous materials, around their operations, right? Their research grade facilities that they need help with, and Biocom does that, but it's almost more on a local and then federal level. There is still a little bit of a gap, I think, on the state level where we could do better, working closely with GoBiz and maybe with some other groups here about giving those life science service provider companies access to the certifications they need to compete. That's really where I see the hole. It's not really on the industry side, it's on the service provider side.
Got it. Thank you. Speaking of certification, Angela, when we were carrying AB 915, there was a lot of feedback around the exasperated needs of micro businesses in light of the pandemic. There was a kind of a consternation of like, well, we're yes, technically we're a small business, but we're super small, and we still need access, and we still need to get into procurement. And it brought up a question about micro business certification. Is that something that even exists with the state of California? Can you maybe unpack a little bit of what a micro business technically is in the eyes of the state, and what if the percentage of micro businesses within the small business classification?
Sure. So first and foremost, a micro business is a small business. So, from the DGS perspective, we consider a micro business, first and foremost, they're a small business. We don't separate them out when talking about our small businesses. And we don't want anybody else to separate them out. We want them to understand that they are a small business. But to your point, they are a smaller small business in that they're capped at 5 million to have that designation of a micro business. So it's their 3-year gross annual receipts cannot be more than 5 million, and their employee count has to be under 100. And so they're again considered the smaller subset of the small business category, but they are also considered a small business. And so in terms of the number of certifieds, unfortunately, I don't have that statistic with me right now as to what their breakout is, but I can tell you that their participation in state contracting for the 19-20 fiscal year was upwards of 40%. So in awards to micro businesses for state contracting, they got roughly 40% of the awards to all small businesses. So, that's a pretty good indicator that, the state is using micro business, but that doesn't necessarily speak to some of the challenges that micro businesses may have because they are the smaller subset of the overall small business entity. And I would say that some of those things are, some of the things that Rick talked about with, capital, getting access to capital that you are going to need when you perform on a state contract. First and foremost, because of our prompt payment rules, you will not get paid up to 45 days. That is the state's statutory process. And I think that's a challenge for a lot of small businesses. And it becomes an even greater challenge for them if for some reason there's a delay in that payment. And so that's access to capital is really one of the biggest things that we hear when we're doing our outreach for folks that want to get their foot in the door or are actively participating on state contracts is the prompt payment element. Some of the other things are their requirements, experience requirements for the state. So, if you're a smaller small business, you may not have some of those experience requirements to even perform on the contract. And so that's one of the areas that we're also looking into, starting with our large scale leverage procurement agreements, where we want small businesses to participate. We're looking at lowering those experience requirements. So instead of, for example, you have to have had X number of contracts with the State Department, perhaps you only need to have X number of contracts as a subcontractor, right? So you don't have to have been a prime to get on state contracts. As long as you have some experience with state, local, federal, we want to give you that opportunity to participate. And so, those, again, costs, making sure that our state departments are looking at best value versus low bid. Low bid is a requirement of law, but when it comes to DGS, large scale contracts, leverage procurement agreements, our state departments can look at best value on behalf of small businesses. And so there's an opportunity there to, look at cost and how overall what they're offering the state is a value versus just looking at low bid. So I think those are some of those barriers that I think our micro businesses in general face, because they are the smaller subset of the small business population.
Thanks for that. And is there an actual, and I should know the answer to this, is there an actual micro business certification, or is it just a designation based on their gross receipts?
It's a designation that they get.
Okay.
So because again, you're considered a small business first and foremost. Right. But if you are, you meet the 5 million and the under 100, then you're designated as a micro business, a small business, micro business. Got it. Is what your designation then becomes. So it's based on the dollar value, but you're still considered a small business.
Very good. We're getting close to time, and then after that we'll have a second poll, which will lead into equity in energy, which is the next panel after this. Senator Mann, I want to give you the final word, and maybe if you could give us a glimpse as to what your legislative priorities might be, non-binding, of course, going into this next session that are around whether it be procurement or not, around small business and supporting small business.
Well, as I said at the beginning of this call, and thank you for that question. Again, thank you to CalAsian Chamber for hosting this event today. As I said at the outset, I've actually been texting with the Assembly Member Chu about AB 915. And David, I'd be glad to work with you and the CalAsian Chamber and others to try to see if we can cross the finish line this time and see what happened in Senate appropriations. Appropriations, as we all know, is a place where bills go to die, and sometimes for reasons we don't understand. But maybe trying to, unwind that and see if there's a pathway to move this forward, because I think it's an important bill. And, for a state that prides itself on inclusion and diversity, sometimes we don't do a good job of putting our money where our mouth is. And this one seems easy because it's not necessarily creating like new funding. It's just allocating it in ways that I think we would all agree are equitable. So that's something I plan to carry next year. As I mentioned, I think it's SB 430 that Andreas Borges authored. I can look at my notes here to see what the bill was. But that is the bill I mentioned. Yes, 430 that would have created a process by which every regulatory agency in the state would be required to create a process for waiving or reducing penalties for infractions or violations of regulations that were both inadvertent and cause no harm. And I think if you're doing it on accident, it's easy to violate one of the myriad of regulations out there. It doesn't harm anyone. Why should you be penalized, particularly in ways that are often very draconian, as some of these penalties are? So I think this is a reasonable bill. I think it didn't get through last time, in part because we have a majority Democratic legislature, and unfortunately the politics being the way they are, perhaps having a Democrat like myself carry this, we're hoping we'll see better results. And then as far as other items, I'm open to suggestions. I'd love to carry, as I mentioned, more bills that, try to create more reasonable regulatory, sort of environments for small businesses. Can we reduce overlapping compliance requirements? Can we get those 12, different types of forms that you have to fill out if you're a restaurant at the state level? into maybe one or two. Why should we have to report to different regulators? Can't we have a single point of contact or maybe 2 points of contact? So trying to think through some of these things, and obviously these are going to be very industry specific, but we'd love to carry those types of bills. So if there are folks on this call that have suggestions, we'd love to hear them.
Yeah, Senator, I would just add, sorry if I could jump in, David.
Go for it.
Good luck cleaning up all the regulations and
Yeah.
and red tape. But
I didn't say all. I said we want to start with some.
Yeah. So good luck. We applaud that ambition. What I would say is in the interim, continuing to fund GoBiz and give them the tools to enable these companies and help them through it is a great maybe easier interim step. So that's a very valuable organization. We make sure we do our part to let these small companies know about GoBiz and all that they offer, but the more that can be beefed up, I think that's a great Band-Aid for some of this deregulation, if you will.
I appreciate that. Yeah. And I guess I should also add, I've been in discussions, more district specific with some of our cities about thinking through whether we can do city sponsored incubators. UC Irvine's got a great, I forget, it's not an incubator, it's kind of the whole soup to nuts, but if we can find ways for the government to, creatively help foster innovation and entrepreneurship, I think that's important, particularly in green innovation, which I think is so critical right now, because we are facing, according to scientists, a pretty dismal future unless we start to really, really develop quickly a series of solutions to get us off of fossil fuels.
Yeah, and the folks in Los Angeles are doing that quite well. This incubator, city and county connected. The Cove in Irvine is what you're talking about.
That's right. Yep.
We have an event there next week. Yeah, totally.
Oh, fantastic! It's a
great observation. That's a really cool program, and we think we'll see more of those coming up in the state.
Fantastic. Well, I appreciate that, Rick, and that's my district. That's about a half mile from my house, so maybe I'll see you there.
Nice.
Well, perfect. This has been a very enlightening and informative panel. I appreciate the shout out to GoBiz. They've been an incredible partner for small businesses, especially facilitating the Small Business Technical Assistance Expansion Program, which provides wraparound technical support for small businesses. It's going into now, I believe it's 5th year. And I can say, this is something I'd be happy to talk with you, Senator, at another time, is making sure that program, it will sunset unless, the budget or legislation is introduced to reauthorize it and hopefully increase the funding to it. Because as we've seen, the need for technical assistance to small businesses, especially minority business owners, could not be more acute. And it's been, I'm proud of the work that the whole network has done this last year and a half since the pandemic, but the work is not done, and it continues to be in demand. We'll be sure to share everyone's contact information, Senator, Angela, Rick, if anyone has any follow-up questions. We'll be sure to communicate that out so that you all can have that type of follow-up. Thank you all for your time. Really, really, really appreciate it. Such great insight and perspectives, and we'll let you get on with the rest of your day. So thank you all very, very much.
Thank you.
Thank you, David.
Thank you so much.